There's a photograph that sits in the Crawford family archive. It's dated 1913. In it, 7 children stand in a row outside a farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania. They're dressed in their Sunday clothes, hands folded, faces solemn. But if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice something that shouldn't be possible. Each child, regardless of age or gender, has an identical crescent-shaped scar just below their left ear. The same length, the same depth, the same precise curve. And according to every living Crawford descendant, each of those children claimed to remember the exact moment they received it, even though none of them were old enough to form memories yet. Even though it happened before they were born. The Crawford line didn't start in Pennsylvania. It started in a place most maps have long forgotten, a settlement called Stillwater Hollow in the Appalachian backwoods of Western Virginia. The family tree goes back to 1768, when a man named Josiah Crawford arrived with his wife, carrying nothing but a Bible, a hunting rifle, and a leather-bound journal that would remain sealed for over 200 years. The people of Stillwater Hollow were an isolated group, suspicious of outsiders, bound by traditions no one outside the hollow could understand. They didn't welcome strangers, but Josiah wasn't a stranger. According to the town records, what little survived, he was expected. Every generation since Josiah has told the same story. Every Crawford child, upon learning to speak, would describe the same nightmare. They would wake screaming about a man with no face standing at the edge of a forest. They would draw the same symbols in the dirt, spirals and crosses that matched carvings found on trees deep in the woods around Stillwater Hollow. And they would touch the scar below their ear and say the same 5 words, as if reciting something they'd been taught in a language they didn't yet know. He marked us to remember. No doctor could explain it. No priest would discuss it. And by the time the 20th century arrived, the Crawford family had learned to stop asking questions. They simply accepted that their children would be born with the mark, that they would share the memory, that something in their blood was older than reason and darker than anything they wanted to understand. This is the story of what they remembered, and why, by the end, some of them wished they'd been born into any other family but this one. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Journal of Josiah Crawford was finally opened in 1972 by his great-great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Margaret Crawford Hale. She was a librarian in Pittsburgh, methodical and skeptical, who'd spent most of her life dismissing the family stories as superstition. But when her own daughter was born with the scar, when that little girl woke up at age 3 screaming about the faceless man, Margaret decided it was time to know the truth. She traveled back to what remained of Stillwater Hollow, now little more than a cluster of collapsed structures and overgrown graves, and retrieved the journal from a lockbox buried beneath the ruins of the original Crawford homestead. What she found inside changed everything she thought she understood about her family. Josiah's entries began normally enough. Descriptions of the journey westward, notes on the weather, observations about the land. But by the 3rd week, the tone shifted. He wrote about hearing voices in the forest at night, about finding carved symbols on trees that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them, about the people of Stillwater Hollow, who he said were keeping something at bay. He described a ritual the town performed every autumn, something they called the Offering of Remembrance. They would gather at the edge of the forest, and the eldest member of each family would cut a small mark below their left ear. Then they would speak the names of the dead, not their own dead, but others, strangers, people from towns that no longer existed. Josiah didn't understand it, but he wrote that he felt compelled to participate, that refusing felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. On October 13th, 1768, Josiah made his first offering. He wrote that the moment the blade touched his skin, he saw something, not with his eyes, but inside his mind, like a memory that didn't belong to him. He saw a man standing in a clearing, surrounded by women and children. The man had no face, just smooth skin where his features should have been, and the man was holding a book, the pages covered in names. Josiah's name was in that book. So was his wife's. So were the names of children they hadn't yet conceived. He wrote that he tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The faceless man turned the page, and Josiah felt something cold slide into his mind, like a hook behind his eyes. Then the vision ended, and he was back in Stillwater Hollow, blood running down his neck, the townspeople watching him with expressions he described as relieved, but not surprised. That night, Josiah's wife went into labor. Even though she was only 5 months along, the child was stillborn, but before they buried it, Josiah unwrapped the cloth and saw the mark below its ear, the same crescent, the same depth. He wrote only one line about it. It was already claimed. Margaret Crawford Hale stopped reading the journal after that entry. She told her husband she needed air. She walked outside into the ruins of Stillwater Hollow and vomited into the weeds. But she went back. She kept reading, because by then, she understood that the scar on her daughter's neck wasn't some genetic anomaly. It was a signature, and whatever had signed it was still waiting. Josiah had 11 more children over the next 20 years. 8 survived infancy. Every single one was born with the mark. And according to his journal, every single one began speaking about the faceless man before they turned 4 years old. They would tell Josiah the same things he'd seen in his vision. They described the clearing, the book of names, the feeling of being watched from just beyond the tree line. Josiah tried to leave Stillwater Hollow twice, once in 1773, and again in 1779. Both times, he made it less than 30 miles before one of his children became violently ill, seizing, bleeding from the nose, whispering in a language Josiah didn't recognize. The moment he turned back toward the hollow, the child recovered. He never tried to leave again. The townspeople wouldn't explain what was happening. Or maybe they couldn't. Josiah wrote that they seemed bound by something older than words, some agreement made long before any of them were born. He described watching the town's children play near the forest edge, always stopping at the same invisible line, as if they could sense something the adults had learned not to see. He wrote about finding stones arranged in patterns in the woods, circles within circles, always surrounding a single object. A piece of cloth. A rusted nail. Once, a child's shoe, so old it crumbled when he touched it. He asked the town elder what the stones meant. The man looked at him for a long time, then said only this: "They're keeping count." In 1786, the town held another offering of remembrance. But this time, something went wrong. Josiah didn't record what happened during the ritual itself. Several pages were torn from the journal, but the entry that followed was barely legible, written in a frantic scrawl. He described a sound that came from deep in the forest, something between a scream and a bell. He wrote that every person at the ritual collapsed simultaneously, as if something had reached inside them and pulled. When they woke, 3 of the town's elders were dead. No marks on their bodies, no explanation, just gone, as if their lives had been subtracted from the world. And Josiah's youngest son, a boy of 7, walked into the house and told his father something that made Josiah weep. The boy said, "He showed me everyone who forgot. He showed me what happens when the names aren't spoken." Josiah wrote that he finally understood. The mark wasn't just a scar. It was a registry, a way of ensuring that certain souls, certain bloodlines would carry forward the memory of something that had been buried, something that required witnesses. And if the witnesses ever stopped remembering, if the names were ever forgotten, then whatever was in those woods would be free to collect what it was owed. By 1812, Stillwater Hollow was dying, not from disease or famine, but from something slower and more deliberate. Families stopped having children. The ones who did often lost them before their first birthday. Josiah's own line was one of the few still producing descendants, and he wrote that the townspeople had begun looking at his children differently, not with warmth, but with a kind of desperate gratitude, as if the Crawford bloodline was holding something in place that would collapse without them. Josiah was 73 years old by then, and his handwriting had become shaky, but his entries grew more urgent. He wrote that he'd begun to understand the true nature of the bargain. Stillwater Hollow wasn't just a town, it was a containment site, and the families who lived there weren't residents. They were wardens. He described finding older journals hidden in the town's meeting house records that went back to 1647, decades before Stillwater Hollow officially existed. The documents spoke of a group of settlers who'd come to the Virginia wilderness, fleeing something in Europe, something they referred to only as the accountant. They wrote about a being that collected debts no one remembered owing, that appeared in the dreams of entire villages and demanded payment in the form of memory, not individual memories, collective ones, the memories that held communities together, the stories of who they were and where they came from. Towns that refused to pay simply forgot themselves into oblivion. People would wake up not knowing their own children's names. Families would sit at dinner tables and stare at each other like strangers. And within a generation, the town would be gone, erased so completely that even maps would seem to forget it had ever existed. The settlers who founded Stillwater Hollow made a different choice. They offered a bargain. They would serve as rememberers, vessels who would carry forward the names of those who'd already been taken, ensuring that the accountant's ledger remained balanced. In exchange, their town would be spared. But the bargain came with conditions. Every generation had to participate in the offering. Every family had to bear the mark. And the memories they carried couldn't be their own. They had to belong to the dead, to the already collected, so that the debt would never fully close. The scar was the proof of agreement. The shared memory was the currency. And the faceless man was the collector, always watching, always counting, making sure no one tried to break the contract. Josiah Crawford hadn't come to Stillwater Hollow by accident. He'd been summoned. His name had been in the ledger before he was born, written there by an ancestor who'd made a promise on behalf of all his descendants. And now, 4 generations later, Josiah finally understood what that promise meant. His children didn't just remember the faceless man, they remembered everyone the faceless man had taken. Every forgotten soul, every erased life. The weight of all that loss lived inside them, passed down through blood, growing heavier with each generation. And as long as they remembered, the accountant would leave the world alone. But Josiah also understood something else, something that terrified him more than anything he'd written before. The bargain was breaking. Josiah Crawford died in 1814. His final entry, dated 3 days before his death, contained only a single sentence. The children are remembering things that haven't happened yet. By the time the American Civil War began, Stillwater Hollow was abandoned. The last families left between 1856 and 1859, scattering across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky. They didn't leave because they wanted to. They left because the town had become uninhabitable. Multiple accounts from former residents described the same phenomena. Voices calling from the forest at all hours. Shadows that moved against the light. The sensation of being watched by something that stood just outside the periphery of vision. Always present but never fully seen. And the children, God. The children, they stopped sleeping. They would sit upright in their beds, eyes open but unseeing, reciting names in monotone voices for hours. Names no one recognized. Names that seemed to come from languages that no longer existed. The Crawford family settled in a small town outside Pittsburgh called Ember Falls. By then, the family had fractured into 3 branches, but all of them carried the mark. All of them reported the same experiences with their children, and all of them had begun to notice something new. The shared memory was evolving. It was no longer just the faceless man in the clearing. Now the children described rooms, dozens of them, hundreds. Each room contained a person sitting perfectly still, staring at nothing, mouths moving soundlessly. The children said the rooms went on forever, stacked on top of each other, stretching down into darkness. And at the center of it all was the accountant, still faceless, still turning pages in his book, adding names faster than they could be spoken. In 1903, a Crawford daughter named Anne gave birth to twins. Both had the mark. But one of them, a boy named Thomas, was different. He didn't just remember the vision. He could draw it. By age 5, he'd filled dozens of notebooks with sketches. The clearing, the trees, the symbols carved into bark. But he also drew things no one had described before. He drew doors, hundreds of them, arranged in spirals, each one slightly ajar, and behind each door was a face. Not faceless, these had features, expressions, identities. They looked afraid. Thomas told his mother that these were the people who'd tried to run, the ones who'd broken the contract. He said the accountant had put them in the room so they could watch what happened to everyone they loved, so they could see their families forget them, generation by generation, until even their names turned to dust. Anne burned the notebooks. She forbade Thomas from drawing, but he didn't stop. He carved the images into wood, into stone, into the dirt beneath the porch. And when Anne finally asked him why he couldn't just let it go, Thomas looked at her with eyes far too old for a child and said, "Because he wants us to know. He wants us to understand what we're holding back. And he wants us to be afraid of what happens if we ever stop. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline?" By 1947, the Crawford family had developed what they called the protocol. It was never written down, couldn't be written down, but every parent taught it to their children the moment they were old enough to understand. When the nightmares started, you didn't comfort the child. You listened. You wrote down every name they spoke, every detail they described, and you added it to the family record. When they drew the symbols, you kept the drawings. When they asked why they had the scar, you told them the truth, because lying only made it worse. The children who were shielded from the knowledge, the ones whose parents tried to raise them normal, those were the ones who broke. They would wake up screaming at 15, at 20, at 35, suddenly drowning in memories that didn't belong to them, unable to distinguish between their own lives and the thousands of lives they carried inside their heads. Some of them ended up in institutions. Some of them simply disappeared, last seen walking toward forests they'd never been to, following roads that didn't exist on any map. The protocol kept the family functional, but it didn't keep them whole. Depression ran through the Crawford line like a second bloodstream. Suicide rates were abnormally high, especially among the men. They would reach a certain age, usually mid-40s, and something would shift. They would become distant, hollow, as if the weight of all those memories had finally crushed whatever made them themselves. In 1961, a Crawford named Robert drove his car into the Allegheny River. He left a note that said only, "I can't carry them anymore. There are too many. I'm sorry." His son found the note. His son, who was 12 years old, who already had the scar, who already knew what his father meant. Margaret Crawford Hale's research didn't end with Josiah's journal. She spent the next decade tracking down every surviving branch of the family, conducting interviews, collecting testimonies. What she discovered was that the shared memory was accelerating. In Josiah's time, children didn't start having the visions until age 3 or 4. By the early 1900s, it was 18 months. By the 1970s, some Crawford infants were being born already marked not just with the scar, but with the knowledge. They would emerge from the womb and their eyes would track things that weren't there. They wouldn't cry like normal babies. They would stare, silent and aware, as if they were seeing through the walls of the delivery room into somewhere else entirely. Margaret interviewed a woman named Claire Crawford, who'd given birth in 1983. Claire described holding her newborn daughter and watching the infant's eyes move across the hospital ceiling, following something. Claire asked the nurse if she saw anything. The nurse said no, but Claire's daughter, barely 6 hours old, turned her head and looked directly at her mother, and Claire swore the child's expression was one of profound sadness, not the confusion of a newborn, not the simple emotions of an infant, but the bone-deep sorrow of someone who'd lived 1,000 lifetimes and remembered every one of them. Claire told Margaret she almost dropped her daughter, not out of disgust, but out of horror at what kind of life she'd just brought into the world. Margaret's final report, compiled in 1989, contained a conclusion she shared with no one outside the family. She wrote that the bargain was collapsing not because the Crawfords had failed to keep it, but because they'd kept it too well. The accountant's ledger had grown so vast, so impossibly heavy with names and memories, that it was beginning to overflow. The children weren't just remembering the dead anymore. They were remembering the process of forgetting itself. They were experiencing, in real time, what it felt like for a soul to be erased. And that meant the containment was breaking. Whatever Stillwater Hollow had been built to hold back was beginning to seep through. In 2008, the last gathering of the Crawford family took place in a rented hall outside Philadelphia. 63 people attended. Every single one of them had the scar. They came from 12 different states, some of them meeting for the first time, but they all recognized each other instantly, not by appearance, but by something deeper, a shared heaviness, a way of moving through the world like they were carrying invisible weight. They didn't gather to celebrate. They gathered to decide whether the bloodline should continue. A woman named Sarah Crawford stood up and told the room about her son. He was 9 years old. He hadn't spoken in 2 years. He spent his days sitting in his bedroom, drawing the same door over and over again, thousands of iterations, covering every surface. Sometimes he would stop and put his hand against the wall, as if feeling for a handle. Sarah's voice broke when she described finding him one morning standing in the corner of his room, facing the wall, whispering a name. Not his own name, not anyone in the family. A name that sounded ancient, guttural, wrong. When she touched his shoulder, he'd turned around and looked at her with eyes that didn't recognize her at all. He'd said, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, "He's almost finished counting." Other families shared similar stories. A girl in Oregon who'd stopped eating, claiming she could taste the memories, and they made her sick. A teenager in North Carolina who'd carved the spiral symbol into his own chest, saying he needed to make the mark deeper so it would hold. A man in his 50s who'd walked into the woods behind his house and hadn't come out. Search parties found his clothes arranged in a perfect circle, but no body. Just his shoes, placed side by side, pointing toward a tree that had symbols carved so deep into the bark that the tree had begun to die around them. The family archivist, a Crawford named Michael, presented the genealogical records. He'd traced the line back as far as documentation allowed and had made a discovery that chilled everyone in the room. The family wasn't growing. It was consolidating. Crawfords were increasingly marrying other Crawfords, distant cousins. Third and fourth generation connections without realizing the relation until after the children were born. And those children were different. The mark was larger. The memories came faster. Some of them spoke in full sentences before age 1, and the sentences were always the same. Coordinates, dates, names of places that no longer existed. Michael's theory was that the bloodline was being concentrated, refined, turned into something more efficient at carrying the load. He said the word that no one wanted to hear. We're not evolving, we're being prepared. The vote was conducted in silence. Should they continue having children, knowing what those children would inherit? Or should they let the Crawford line end, and with it, whatever bargain their ancestors had made? The room was divided almost perfectly. 31 votes to continue, 32 votes to end it. But before the final count could be confirmed, a child in the back of the room, a girl no older than 7, stood up on her chair and said something that made every person in that hall go silent. She said, "It doesn't matter if you stop. He already has enough of us. He's been collecting other families too. You were never the only ones. You were just the first ones who stayed." No one had told her about the accountant. No one had explained the bargain. But she described him perfectly. The faceless man. The book. The rooms full of people who'd tried to run. And then she said the thing that Margaret Crawford Hale had written in her private notes but never spoken aloud. He doesn't need you to remember anymore. He needs you to forget. Because once you do, he can finally close the book. And when the book closes, all the doors open. The gathering ended without a conclusion. Families left quietly, driving back to their separate lives, carrying their separate griefs. Some of them stopped having children, some of them didn't. But all of them understood, in the way that the Crawfords had always understood, that the choice had never really been theirs to make. As of today, there are an estimated 214 living members of the Crawford bloodline scattered across North America. Every single one of them has the scar. And if you ask them if you find one and ask them directly what they remember, they'll all tell you the same thing. They remember a door that's been closed for a very long time. They remember the sound of a lock that's starting to turn. And they remember the faceless man, standing on the other side, patient as stone, waiting for the moment when the last name is spoken, and the ledger finally balances, and the long-held debt comes due. Some legacies are passed down through blood. Some are carved into skin. And some are older than memory itself, written into the fabric of families who never asked to be chosen, but who carry the weight anyway, generation after generation, until the weight becomes all they are. The Crawford family is still out there, still marked, still remembering. And if you ever meet someone with a crescent-shaped scar just below their left ear, maybe don't ask them where it came from, because the answer is something you were never supposed to know. And once you know it, you'll carry it too. Some doors are meant to stay closed, some names are meant to be forgotten, and some families are meant to stand guard at the edge of the world, holding back the dark, until the day they can't anymore. That day might be closer than any of us think.